Hello, this is MusicTechHelpGuy, and welcome to episode 71 of my Logic Pro 10 video tutorial series. This is what part are we on? Part 13 of my mixing mini-series, and we're still working with our song, Living on the Run. If you'd like to purchase this session for practicing mixing, I'll leave a link in the video description below. In the previous episode, we talked about adding reverb to an aux track and then busing the signal over to that aux track. What I want to do today is I want to go over Space Designer, just do a tutorial on what everything does and understanding how convolution reverbs work. Because a lot of them are a lot of reverbs are the same. Kind of with compression, there's a lot of parameters that are going to be the same in almost all reverbs, just like in compression, just like in EQs. Although Space Designer is a bit special though because it's a convolution reverb. Not to say it's the only one out there. There's plenty of convolution reverbs out there. It's just that convolution reverbs tend to reproduce real-life acoustic environments better than, say, a synthesized reverb. And the way convolution reverbs work is you can record an impulse response of a room with a couple speakers and a couple microphones, and then you can save that impulse response, load it in the reverb, and then the reverb can basically interpret the data from that impulse response and recreate the room that you recorded it from. So it's really cool. One thing that we won't get into in this video is there's actually an impulse response utility that comes with Space Designer that actually lets you create your own reverbs, which is really cool. We're not going to really get into that. I might consider covering it in a future video, but for this video, we're going to more or less stick with the presets and then the pre-made impulse responses, which are really good, by the way. They're, the presets in Space Designer alone are really awesome. Okay, so what I'm doing is I've got the drum verb aux track soloed, which is basically where all my reverb is going, or where all my reverb is coming from for all of my drums. And what I did before is I said if you're putting reverb on an aux track and bussing over to it, you want to make sure that you put your dry signal all the way down and your reverb or wet signal up a bit. So the goal was so that we could separate our drum dry sound from the wet sound. For this, just for this being a demonstration, I'm going to sort of pull the dry up too so I can hear the drums in there as well. So now we're hearing the dry signal of the drums and the wet signal of the drums. I may pull this down from time to time just to demonstrate what's going on. Also, the setting I'm using is under medium spaces, plate reverbs, drum plate. And almost, I think pretty much all of the presets in Space Designer come from the Apple Impulse Response library that comes with Logic. You can load them up there, but you can also go to this area that says IR sample, click the down arrow, and then just choose load IR. And then under audio, impulse responses, Apple, you'll see basically all of the same presets that we saw up in the menu there. So we can, typically I'm just going to load things from the presets though. So let's go back and choose that drum plate. All right, so we've already established the dry and wet signal. Let's talk about this volume envelope. This is called a button bar up here, and there's a series of different parameters we can control and we can change in sort of our main window here. So the first one is our volume envelope. The volume envelope is basically just the volume of the reverb. And by default, this reverb has sort of a bit of an arc to it. So let's say I want this to be a bit more linear, maybe sort of like an exponential curve. Up in the upper right here, there's this little dot, and that dot controls the decay, or there's two dots rather, control the decay of the volume of the reverb. So if I pull this way up, I'm going to get a more dense reverb. If I pull this down, I'm going to get a quicker decay, much like an envelope in a synthesizer. So we're not hearing as much of the tail of the reverb. In addition to controlling the decay of it, you can also grab this bar right here, and you can sort of set the divide between the attack and decay time of the reverb. So everything on the right side is the decay of the verb. Everything on the left is the attack of the verb. So you can actually create sort of swelling, and you'll see there's two additional controls over here. Now I can sort of create like a swelling reverb that sort of swells in and then swells out, slowly swells in, sort of like an attack time on a synthesizer's envelope. So if you're trying to create sort of like a gated effect or like a special effect on a synthesizer or something, you could use it that way. One thing you'll notice is every time I make a change, this little bar here loads, and that's just because our current reverb is based on a real audio file, a real impulse response. It actually takes just a moment for that impulse response to load and change and adapt to the changes we make. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click reset here just to reset the envelope. Let's go back to something a bit more reasonable. There we go. There we go. There's also a filter envelope button up here, which basically controls, it's an envelope that controls the filter down here. Now, if the filter's off, you're not even going to hear, anything. And actually, if you turn the filter off, it actually shuts the filter off up here. So, but the filter, you could have a static filter if you just make the decay and attack levels all the same. So you could have there's two different low passes, a 6 dB, 12 dB slope low pass, a band pass, or a high pass. And what you can do is you can set the sort of initial level, and then the end level, and then the break level of the filter envelope. So if I say I want a low pass at 6 dB, that means at this initial level here, I can pull up and down. Notice it controls this down here. I can say I want it to start off really bright. I want the break to sort of come down to, say, 2500. And I want the sort of end point of the decay to come down to 20 hertz. So not only am I sort of fading out the volume of the envelope, I'm also applying a low-pass filter to the reverb tail, which is typical. Reverb in a room, low frequencies are going to tend to sort of spread out and linger longer. High frequencies are going to tend to decay quicker. So this allows us to sort of emulate that, or we can do it in reverse. We could use a high pass filter and do everything the opposite against what normal acoustics would sound like. Again, for special effects. There's also a resonance control, but I don't really use it too much for stuff like this. So we've got a reverb tail that starts off bright and then very quickly sort of scoops out the high end. We can, again, just like with the volume, we can sort of use this for special effects. We could do it in reverse, start with something that's low passed, and then pull up the cutoff frequency, so you get sort of a sweeping effect. I wouldn't use this on acoustic drums, but it might be something that's kind of cool to throw on a synthesizer or maybe some electronic drums. Now, there's also a density envelope. I'm going to skip that and come back to that in a moment, because you'll notice that it's disabled right now. So I'll show you how to turn that on in just a moment. And by the way, if you want to reset both your volume and filter envelopes, if you just click all, it'll reset both the volume and the filter envelope. So with the volume, I'm just going to go back to sort of what I had before, something looking like that. And I'll just pull this up a bit. There we go. All right, there's also an EQ built right into the reverb, so you can sort of balance the frequency content of the reverb. You can turn the EQ on and off here. It's a 4-band EQ, so you have 2 bands and then a high shelf and a low shelf. If you want to understand how EQ works, go back and watch one of the previous episodes of this mini-series where I talk about how EQs work. But let's say I want to sort of boost the frequency of where the snare drum is a bit, maybe like in the 1 to 2 or 5 to 2K range. I can do that. So I can just boost this band. First of all, turn on the band by clicking right here, and then boost or attenuate the band, and then set the center frequency, say right around 1K. And then maybe I want to get some of the kick drum out of there, some of the woofy bass out of the Verb. Let's pull in the low shelf, and let's cut out the low shelf a bit, so you don't get any boomy reverb. Or maybe we want to cut out some of the high end instead. So this just allows us to apply an EQ to the reverb signal so that we don't have to go and add a separate reverb on the channel strip underneath the Space Designer. All right, I'm actually not going to use the EQ because I kind of like the way it sounded before. Now there's also a reverse button over here that's disabled. So why are these 2 buttons disabled? Well, with a real impulse response sample, you cannot adjust the density or reverse it because the impulse response's recorded density is what's going to control the density of the reverb. By density, I mean the number of reflections in the reverb. Keep in mind that reverb is basically just thousands and thousands of hundreds and thousands of just reflections from all different surfaces coming back to a source. And that's why you perceive reverb the way you perceive it, is because it's just many, many, many reflections reflecting off of surfaces coming back to a mic or coming back to your ears. So instead of using a real impulse response or an impulse response sample, we can actually use a synthesized impulse response. With a synthesized IR, it basically just makes a reverb based on the settings that we create, based on our volume envelope, based on the filter, based on our density now. So we have a density envelope that controls basically how many reflections we have. So I can pull down the ramp here, and you'll see that the graphic gets less dense. So we have less reflections. If we pull it up, more reflections. So we're going to get sort of a bigger, fuller sounding reverb if we go with something like this. As opposed to something like this. And for some of these, we're almost starting to hear like little echoes, little flutter echoes. The reason why that's happening is because we've got, when you switch from an IR sample to a synthesized impulse response, it resets the length to 3 seconds, which is really, really long for a reverb. I'm going to set this to 1 second. So we get a more dense reverb up here and a less dense reverb here. So that's the density envelope. Another great thing you can do with synthesized IRs is you can actually reverse them. So if you want to create weird reversing effects, well, you can do that. We just pull the dry signal down. So there's all sorts of cool little effects you can create with that. All right, let's go back to the IR sample here. One thing just to mention is that when you're using an IR sample, you're limited to the actual length of the audio file, the length of the IR. So I can't, like for this one, 0.969 seconds is the maximum level for it. And you'll find that for a lot of the presets, they have a fixed length. You can go shorter, but you can't go longer. All right, one other thing up here, you can adjust the sample rate of the reverb, which is really cool because a lot of older digital reverbs, like old hardware reverbs, the actual reverb tails ran at a little bit lower sample rate than the sample rate of, say, the session or the sample rate of the audio. In my case, this session's at 48,000. So if I keep this on original, I'm going to get a really bright, rich, I'll say harmonically rich reverb. If I pull this down to half, it's basically lowering the sample rate of the reverb down to 24,000. So I'm going to get a bit duller reverb. If I go down to divide by 4, I now have a sample rate of 12,000, so I'm going to get an even duller reverb. And down at 8, even lower. One of the things that happens when you lower the sample rate on something is that the length of it gets longer. If you take a file that was recorded at 48 and you cut it in half, well, it's going to be twice as long now because the playback speed is slower. So you'll see that the length actually changes as you adjust the sample rate. A way to resolve that is just to turn on the preserve length option. So you'll get that lowered sample rate, warmer reverb, but the actual reverb tail won't be any longer. So there we go. All right, what else? Latency compensation. There's a latency compensation button that basically you can turn on or turn off. When it's off, basically Space Designer... Well, first of all, Space Designer uses up 128 samples of data as far as latency is concerned to do its processing. If you turn latency compensation on, what it's going to do is it's going to apply delay or latency compensation to your session, play everything. What you're actually hearing is slightly behind where the playhead is. And it does that on purpose because it gives Space Designer time to process the audio. What'll happen is if you turn this off is the reverb tail will sound the same. It's just going to be 128 samples behind. So typically you want to keep this on unless maybe you're tracking. In a tracking situation, you'd have to lower your buffer size to something lower like 64 or 32 samples, which is going to be not enough processing time for reverb for Space Designer to work properly. So in that case, maybe you want to turn this off while you're tracking, or just bypass the plugin altogether while tracking, and then turn it back on while mixing. So and this is one more reason why we stick it on an aux track and not on individual tracks. Because imagine how much processing power that's going to eat up if I had 10 reverbs up here or 10 Space Designers up here. Another option that's a compensation related is volume compensation. Basically what the reverb volume compensation button does is it attempts to match the reverb levels, the reverb volume levels of all of the impulse response samples. Sometimes samples will be recorded a bit quieter, so they need to be a bit louder. If they're too loud, they need to be pulled down. That's basically what this does automatically, is if you have an impulse response sample that's too quiet, it'll pull it up. If it's too loud, it'll pull it down. So there's a built-in reference level that goes by to pull up or pull down the volume of reverb. Down here in the bottom, you have, under reverb here, you have pre-delay and IR start. Pre-delay is essentially how much time does it take from the initial strike or hit of the dry signal, in our case, our drums, and the reverb tail. So what that means is every single time a kick or a snare hits, we're actually, if I put it on 40 milliseconds, that means that there's going to be 40 milliseconds between when the kick or the snare hits and the actual reverb tail starts. So basically, if you pull this up to high values, it's going to sound very echoey. It's going to sound like the sound had to travel a long distance and then come back to you, like shouting across a large gym hall or in the Grand Canyon or something like that. If you pull this down to lower values, it's going to sound more like a room or a small hall. Or if you pull it up a little bit higher, it's going to sound like a large hall or like a cathedral. So I'll just pull this down to a low value and just spot some different points. So this is on 0. To see in the upper values, it's almost like a sort of like a slapback echo. I actually like the pre-delay a bit higher because when the reverb tail starts right when the dry signal comes in, it sort of clashes with the dry signal. And so if I pull this up a bit, it sort of emulates a larger room, first of all, but it also keeps the reverb, the front end of the reverb tail from colliding with from each note in the dry signal. The IR start controls where in the impulse response does the reverb tail actually start. So if you pull this up, it'll actually start later in the reverb tail. And if you pull it down all the way down, it'll actually start at the very beginning of the impulse response. So you don't have to actually use the entire impulse response file. You can make it start later on and just see what effects you get from that. So you can see if I pull this up, we're getting a bit shorter reverb because we're starting further in, like halfway through the impulse response file. If I pull this all the way down, we're getting the full reverb tail from the impulse response. So we get a bit longer reverb. And lastly, there's some spread controls here. These are only accessible when you use a synthesized IR. The spread is basically a stereo spread effect, but it is controlled by the X-over or crossover. Basically what happens in real acoustic environments is that, and I kind of said this before, is that bass frequencies tend to last longer and they also tend to spread out all over the place. High frequencies tend to be more unidirectional, so they tend to just go in one direction. So what the crossover does is it determines the crossover frequency at which frequencies are spread across the left and right channels to sort of keep low frequencies from building up in the center of the mix with our reverb. So if I choose, and actually one cool thing is if you pull the spread up, you can actually see it up here. It shows you the left and right spread. But if I pull the crossover frequency down, say to 810, what this means is all frequencies below 810 hertz are going to be spread over your left and right channels, whereas everything above 810 is going to be more in the center. And generally, a lot of people would think, oh, why not spread the high frequencies? Well, I mean, you can still do that if you pull it all the way up. Now everything below 16,000 is spread, so you're getting more highs in the spreading effect. But again, it goes back to room acoustics. Low frequencies tend to spread out more. High frequencies tend to stay, in one direction. So that's sort of what this emulates. So let me just show you with this all the way down, and then I'll show you with it up. And there you go. So that's Space Designers can, most of its important controls in a nutshell. Actually, there's one more thing I do want to show, the definition values here. Definition is basically the overall diffusion of the reverb tail. At 100%, well, the whole point of having a definition slider here, or definition control, is that the vast majority of the density of the reverb happens at the front end of the reverb, not towards the end. So what you can do is as you pull this up, you're sort of diffusing the reverb past this point and more or less using just what's up here. The good thing about this is it can sort of make the tail of reverb. It doesn't just cut off the reverb right there. What it does is it makes the tail end of the reverb more diffused. So if you pull this all the way up, let's actually go back to our sample here. So if I actually, oh, it's right. It doesn't work when you have a sample. It's just on synthesized IR. If I pull this all the way up, you're going to get a more dense reverb. If I pull this down, what's going to happen is sounds toward the end of the reverb tail are going to more quickly diffuse than content toward the beginning of the reverb tail. So the cool thing about this is when you pull it down, you can pull it down quite a bit, you know, almost to where you can't hear too much of a noticeable tone difference, but you're actually saving on processing power by doing so. I normally don't use it. I usually just keep it all the way up unless there's a CPU problem. And then I might try putting on 50 or 60 just to sort of not eat up as much processing power. And there's also a seconds control. That's, you know, these two are essentially the same control. They just are showing you two different values in seconds or in percentages. The only other thing I want to show you, I'm going to have to sort of off-screen this and come back to it, is you can actually create your own impulse response just by dragging in an audio sample or an audio clip, which is really cool. I mean, like I said, it comes with an IR utility, which is a separate application where you can create your own impulse responses, but it's a bit difficult because you have to have a couple mics or at least one mic and a speaker to sort of capture the impulse response or the reflections of the room. And you can sort of deconvolve that IR and throw it in Space Designer and have your own custom reverb. That would take a whole other video for me to go over, so I'm not going to bother. I'm not going to bother with that. But one quick thing that you can do is you can drag a file directly in the main window and create your own impulse response. So I'm just going to off-screen this, and I'll be right back. All right, I'm back, and I want to show you one of my favorite things that you can do with Space Designer, and it's so easy. You can actually create your own impulse responses from any audio file. So what I've got here is just a little piano idea. It's just completely dry. There's a limiter and EQ on it, but no reverb. And I've just got this audio file down here that's just sort of like a synth chord. So what you can do is you can actually drag and drop an audio file right into Space Designer. So let me throw Space Designer on my piano track here. You can't drag it directly from here and drop it in, but if I export this audio file as a, just right click and choose export as audio file. If I save it to the desktop, I'll call it synth chord 1. And by the way, if you right click and you don't see export, you just go down to export and then export as audio file. And then the next time you right click, you'll see it toward the top. So then all you have to do is take that synth chord wave file, drop it right into the middle section of Space Designer. What it'll do is it'll create an impulse response out of that synth chord. And when you do things with like synth chords that are already sort of ambient sounding, like loop, even just ambient loops, it really creates some awesome sounds. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the dry signal all the way down and pull the reverb signal up a bit and listen to what this creates. Isn't that amazing? So basically, each one of those piano notes is triggering an impulse response of that chord. So then we blend those two together. We take our dry piano and our sort of ambient sound in there. So try that out. I mean, I really should have shown that more sort of in like the synthesis videos, but the Space Designer almost sort of works like it's like a synthesizer in this respect, in that you can sort of synthesize your own reverb tail, your own impulse response from anything, any audio file. Once again, if you want to purchase this session to practice mixing, there's a link down in the video description below. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and thanks again for watching.